Last week, we began our conversation with Anne Norton, a professional genealogist and an expert in oral traditions, and Elizabeth Goddard, best-selling author of Never Let Go, a romantic suspense novelist featuring a forensic genealogist. We learned all kinds of things about how and why to learn and tell our family stories. So join us today for the conclusion of that conversation.
I'm Amy Boland, literacy specialist, writer, and college instructor.
And I'm Holland Webb, a full-time writer and editor. And this is the Afterword. Elizabeth, what's a good metaphor to help us understand genealogy?
You're asking the writer, and I don't really think I have a good metaphor, but I keep going back to what's in my grandmother's book that she created for me with our family roots. And she has on there, a family tree can wither if nobody tends its roots. So that's, the family tree, the creation of the family tree, that's just, to me, a great metaphor, I think. We can understand and see how the tree has deep roots, and then it grows up and spreads out, and generations to come keep growing on the tree.
Love that.
What do you think, Anne? What's a good metaphor to help us understand genealogy?
I don't have one.
Okay.
It's one of those things that I heard you say, though, from our previous episode was how much time it takes to do good research. So I almost wonder if some sort of timepiece would be almost another good metaphor for genealogy, because time does pass. But then you also mentioned it is circular.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
If we don't learn from the past, we are bound to repeat it. Right?
Right.
So I almost wonder if a clock might be another type of metaphor.
Absolutely. It never runs down. You can ignore it, but it's going to keep on ticking.
That's right.
And you can either keep up with it, ignore it, but it's going to be there. You'll wake up in the middle of the night and hear it ticking. Particularly once you start doing the genealogy, it'll be there in the middle of the night for sure.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Elizabeth, about tending it, because I think that's such a good thing. One of the sweet antiques that my grandmother had was an old clock, and she had someone repair it and get it started. And it was just this beautiful piece that sat on the mantle. And, both of my families on both sides have done genealogy studies. And I do think there's a little ego, maybe. There might be a little mythology. We are supposedly related to Pocahontas and Queen Anne Boleyn.
Oh, cool.
I know. So I'm going to need to do a little digging here to make sure it's actual truth and not mythology.
I would like to interject. When I worked in Denver at the library there, worked in the Western history and genealogy department, we decided that we were just going to get a family tree, a blank family tree, but fill in part of it so that everyone who came in and said they were related to Jesse James could already just fill it in. And that would done and done. My work here is done. You're absolutely right. You are related because that's what everyone in the family has told you your entire life.
Yes.
It must be true.
Yes.
It must be true.
Yes. Well, that is true, and as a teacher, and I think about history, and sometimes, we assign these family history projects, and how can we be sensitive? Because you mentioned a couple things in our previous episode about, especially when we are thinking about minorities, and how can we be sensitive? Because sometimes our family tree, our family history isn't all filled with wonderful memories. And maybe it's hard. I will remember as a young girl having to write about my mom. And I was 8 when she passed away. So that assignment was really, really painful as a young girl. And so how can we be sensitive as we think about genealogy and history?
I think it's extremely important to do some prep work before you jump into writing a family tree if you're dealing with children, young people, and really talking about, as a group, what is a family. And I would start very broad, that we are all related. That's my own take on it. Who do you live with is different from who is your family. It's very different, often. I think it creates a comfort level that you can talk about with the children and the students. The people in this room are your family. We are the family of man. We're here to care about each other. We're here to love each other, respect one another, honor each other's story. And each of you children have your own story. Who do you want to be your family? Because you do have a choice as we get older. We know that. We choose who we want to be our family. Sometimes our families are not the best people for us to be around. I'm not going to say that to a child, but I want to make them feel comfortable with who family is.
That's amazing. I just want to sit next to Anne and just let her give out this place of peace, because I feel so comfortable thinking about family. And even if I were to assign this, because we do live in a very multicultural world, maybe not necessarily in the South all the time, but we do rub shoulders with so many people with different stories.
Yes. And the comfort level is, if it is not innate, it can be taught. I believe it can be taught. We can teach each other that.
Right. I think about a lot of different groups in any public school or in many private schools where you would go and find kids who've been adopted, kids who are in foster care. The upstate where we live and Michigan, where Elizabeth lives, are both resettlement areas for refugees from other countries.
Right.
Kids who've come whose only parent in the U.S. has just come from abroad, and they may not have access to records, and I don't know how records work in forced migration situations, but I would think that your ancestry doesn't follow you. I mean, just so many different people who would struggle as they think about this. And yet it used to be, at least, I don't know about now, but it used to be a kind of standard assignment in elementary school. Let's make a family tree.
Yes. And in Scouts. Because in the library, for years, the Scouts would come in to get their genealogy badge. The Cub Scouts would come in to look at records and things like that. Not really doable today. Not really fair, I will say.
So if you are interviewing a member of your family about their life when they were a child, what are some good questions to ask?
I will say there are excellent oral history guides and oral history questions on the internet. And that's a good place to get a template. I always do oral history interviews with the oldest people in the family if I'm taking a client. I'll say, if they can talk with me, let's start there. What is your name? Where were you born? What are your parents' names? What was it like when you were a child? Did you go to school? What was your favorite food? Did you have enough to eat? Did you sleep by yourself, or did you have a lot of brothers and sisters in the bed with you? You can take it from the very broad, standard questions down to how did they live? Did you have an outdoor toilet?
That's excellent.
Did you have a telephone? What happened if did you have a doctor? Did you ever have an immunization for anything? Generally, the person that you're interviewing will take off with that.
And start telling.
And start talking. But you have to listen. You have to be quiet and listen, which is extremely difficult for me, as you can tell.
I would ask the question, and I'm not talking to children in this case, but how did you meet your husband? That gets people talking about this story, and that gives me good fodder for writing my story. So, that's another way to get people talking about their family, and then they just, continue on and on and on. They love to talk about all of that. So that's my question.
How did you meet your husband or wife, I suppose? We asked my grandfather to tell us about his past, and he only told one story. And it was this story about how when he was about 17, 18, he captured a horse and rode it down the middle of the aisle of the movie theater. And the people and the horse went crazy, and they finally got the horse and him on it out of the movie theater. Of course, the horse was terrified. It took off to the edge of town where it finally threw him off. And my other grandfather was driving a vehicle and ran into, they came up to one another, and I was like, by the time he was, this was the only story he told, and I said something about it to my mother, and she said, well, I don't know if he was 100% sober when he was doing this or not. I mean, I kind of think he might not have been.
Oh, and I'll be happy to research that. It's bound to have made the papers.
That was the only story he told. I mean, after that, he didn't say anything else.
That's great.
Okay, we didn't think to ask anything like that. How did you meet your wife?
Yeah, right. Well, and Elizabeth, as a writer, and you were doing some of that research, I'm curious if you ran up against any snafus, any difficulties, because I know Anne has shared a little bit about phonetic spelling of names, things like that. Something that was interesting that I think young people would not know: if a death certificate stated that your ancestor died of consumption, that would have actually meant tuberculosis, which we actually had a case of that in the upstate happen just this past week. So, these are things that are not out of possibility. But what are some difficulties maybe that you found in some of your genealogical research?
Well, really, some of what you just said, I already gave the example of my grandmother, dedicated this book to me, and she gave it to me, and my birth date is incorrect in the book. So, there's going to be mistakes that you have to research, and as Anne's already brought up, misspelling of names and all of that kind of thing. Some of the things, I think it's called the brick wall, right? That's why we hire a genealogist or a forensic genealogist to help us to get past all of those things that we can't get past. I do know some of the things that are interesting, and we've already kind of talked about this, is that people researching their past can come across information that maybe their family, they don't belong to their family. That has happened. And so that is a lot of the stuff that we come up against when we're, you might want to delve into the past, and then again, you might not. I don't know. What do you think, Anne? Do you think that those are good things to find out? Or, knowing the truth is the right thing? Or do you think those things should stay hidden? It's just kind of an interesting, I kind of delved into that in my book. Should the daughter know the truth about her mother?
I always tell clients in my initial meeting, I'm going to tell you the truth. What you do with it is up to you, but I am going to tell you the truth. At the same time, everything that I learn is held in absolute confidence. I don't share with anyone what I find.
Sure.
And I have had that situation that you just described. The grandfather changed his name. He didn't want to be associated with his family anymore. My client had no idea. They had no idea that they were triracial. I could tell by looking at the photographs, but I sat down with the family and I said, look, you are part African American, you are part white, and you are part Native American. And this is how it all came together.
Right. So the truth sometimes it can be hard to swallow, but that genealogy gives us that.
And I don't know if it tells necessarily a better story, but it definitely tells a story.
Absolutely.
It definitely tells a story.
Absolutely. Because how did these people come together in the first place? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why did he change his name?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Real life is stranger than fiction. You heard that saying?
It's so much better than fiction. Yeah.
Can't tell you how many times I've had an editor say, no, you can't do that. Well, it's a true story. But people aren't going to believe it in the actual novel. So it's just kind of funny.
There are a couple of crazy things we found out, actually. One is Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas who was a Republican presidential candidate in 2016, is a 14th cousin to President Barack Obama. Now, this I found on the internet. I don't know if it's true, but I did find it on some reputable site that President Obama and Senator Cruz are 14th cousins, which I thought was pretty wild. But another one, there's a podcast that everybody who's interested in history should listen to this. The Washington Times, I believe, did this. They went through each president every week from George Washington through Donald Trump before the 2016 election. And then the last week, they had one recorded for Trump and one recorded for Clinton, and they were just going to play whichever one won. But the most interesting one to me, they were really well done. The most interesting one was John Tyler, because they would interview family members, they would interview professors who had studied this person, or for more recent people, maybe it was a cabinet member or a journalist who'd covered them. Gerald Ford's son was interviewed, but John Tyler, who was, the 9th president or something like that, they interviewed his grandson because President Tyler, in his 70s, married a woman in her 20s, and they had several children together, one of whom grew up and in his 70s married a woman in her 20s, and they had some children together who are in their 80s. So President Tyler's 2 grandchildren are still alive, and one of them lives at the old Tyler homestead in Northern Virginia. And whenever there's these presidential family gatherings, he goes to it as the oldest grandchild of the farthest back president. And hearing him was so interesting. Of course, he didn't know John Tyler, but still, it was just riveting to think about that. It wasn't that surprising to hear Gerald Ford's son on there, but to hear John Tyler's grandson was pretty wild story.
That is wild. That's just crazy.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Well, Anne, how has your knowledge of genealogy directed some of your work?
I believe it has really honed my skills in digging and realizing that what you see on the surface is not necessarily the fact. I mentioned earlier that doing research is truly like peeling an onion. It doesn't have to be genealogy. For example, when I was doing corporate intelligence work, I had to go beyond what was on the surface of the company I was investigating or the individual I was investigating. I had to go deeper. I needed to find out more about that individual or that company. And I think it makes me more tenacious. I will not give up. I will not give up. Sometimes even after the client tells me, I'm done. Well, I'm not.
Oh, we love a good story. That's awesome. That's fantastic.
You're a character, Anne.
Oh, thank you. I guess. Yeah, well, you are too, Elizabeth.
We all have character, right? Oh, goodness. Elizabeth, what's your favorite family story from your own personal family?
Oh my gosh. Well, I have a lot of stories, and I don't know why this sticks into my head, and it might not even seem funny, but it's just in my head. And so here we go. My mom is always telling the story of that we are descended from Robert the Bruce, and so I have to laugh at this because I'm thinking of Anne saying, the mythology, and everybody's wanting to be descended from, a king or royalty. But anyway, we're descended from Robert the Bruce, and so the women in the family are redheaded and have these big, strong arms, the big arms, redheaded women. My mom was redheaded and had big, strong arms. And so when the wagon wheels, when people immigrated over here, the wagon wheels would break. The women were the ones that would lift the wagon. I know that seems like such a silly story, but it just sticks in my head, especially because my daughter is here with me from California this week, and she was saying, I really want to do one of those DNA genealogy tests, but I am so afraid that we'll end up not being descended from Robert the Bruce. She's like, we'll prove that Grandma Moyers lied to us all this time. So that's, do we want to do the DNA test or do we not? We might find some mythology in all of the years of genealogy that my family put together. So.
That's funny. That's great. How about you, Anne?
I have one that I love, because I continue to think about this person. I had a great-great-uncle named Uncle Allison, that my grandfather told me about. And Uncle Allison wasn't right. He wasn't right. This was in York, South Carolina. And when my grandfather was a little boy and they would go out into the fields to pick cotton or to work, they would set Uncle Allison down under a tree with a bucket of water and a fishing pole. And Uncle Allison would sit there almost all day waiting to catch a fish. I truly believe that. So I followed up on all of these stories that my grandfather told me. And in the census, he's listed as an idiot. Thank goodness they don't do that anymore, have that designation. But he was listed as an idiot. And I think about Allison, and he outlived all of them. They cared for him. They loved him, evidently. And that's another group that I really enjoy researching are the ones that were not right, mentally ill, idiots in the census records, because they had a story too. So Uncle Allison, I relate to. Many days I've spent sitting under a tree, fishing in a bucket, not catching a darn thing.
Love that.
Do you have any other family stories besides a grandfather that rides a horse in a movie theater?
They're all along that line.
Except for
I'm
your
from
aunt
Appalachia.
who drove the...
Who drove the first bookmobile in Kentucky? Yeah, we were talking about that.
I love that.
And my great aunt drove the first bookmobile in Kentucky.
Gave me a heartthrob.
I mean, it was the first. There were a whole fleet that were introduced, and she drove one of them.
Do you have a picture
Of her?
of her in the Anne bookmobile? Or do you know?
Her daughter probably does. I have. Could ask.
I'll work on that for you. Let me know her name.
Okay.
That's exciting.
What about you?
I have so
Any
many
family stories you can tell?
Oh yeah, I've got so many stories, and I love that I got to know my great grandfather. He reverse migrated from Michigan to Virginia, and he was a single child, only child, and so he grew up with lots and lots of adults around him. And one of the adults was Uncle Josiah. And he was a very special man because he was born with the afterbirth on his head.
A call.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so he had special abilities to see into the future
Yes.
and make predictions. And he had the most amazing calligraphy. He was an artist. And so back then, paper was very dear. You didn't have a lot of it. So we have some of his books where he would do art and calligraphy in the covers of the books. And so those are kind of fun stories. And listening to my great-grandfather talk about settling in the area in Virginia where they grew up, and his mother being very upset with Native Americans coming and wanting milk and putting their fingers in her milk to test out to make sure she was not giving them the bad milk. So just listening to those stories, I enjoy those stories on both sides of my family. I feel so blessed to have family on both sides that have researched and done such great work, because story's important.
Absolutely.
And as you said earlier, Anne, we don't live in a vacuum. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about genealogy.
Family stories give us a sense of identity, I think, and a context for our own place in the world. And it creates a personal resilience. You know, when I think about my great-grandmother outliving 5 of her 6 children and her husband, I mean, those kind of stories just give you a whole new perspective on the world. And I think they inform how we read and understand the stories of other people.
Yes.
You know, whether those are true stories or whether we pick up one of Elizabeth's novels and read through it, it gives us a sense of empathy with characters and with other people's stories. So thank you, Anne and Elizabeth. This is a truly personal conversation about the future of words, which
Absolutely.
reaches into the past and the future.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
you.
for
Enjoyed
having
it.
me. Yes,
So-
appreciate it. It was great talking to you guys.
It was great talking to you too. And just a reminder, if you haven't listened to the first episode, that Elizabeth's book, Never Let Go, is available at Barnes & Noble, on Amazon, and on her website, elizabethgoddard.com. And her next book in the series is coming out in October. And what did you tell us it was called?
Always look twice.
Always Look Twice.
And Anne, how can people get a hold of you?
I am not on Facebook. I am not. I do not
That's
have a
okay.
website. I am listed on the Association of Professional Genealogists website, APG. So that's my contact information is there.
Well, next week we'll be talking with Bebe Belford, author of the middle grade novels Canned and Crushed, Crossing the Line, and Another D for Dee Dee. Bebe's work won the Christopher Award for affirming the highest values of the human spirit. She writes about non-controversial topics such as immigration, racism, disability, and religious persecution.
Tongue in cheek.
Oh, wow.
Well, joining Bebe will be Tracy LeGrand, a reading interventionist, mischief manager, and French fry aficionado. More than half of Tracy's students come from low-income families. Her work as an educator and minister's wife has given her a keen sense of justice. So BB and Tracy will be talking about teaching social issues through middle grade novels. So don't forget to subscribe to the afterwordpodcast.com. Like us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Please comment, leave your comments on our website. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, you are welcome at our table.